They say the Stuart dynasty ended with Anne in 1714, but the ledgers don't agree. Between the signatures of kings and queens, there are faint entries, names that shouldn't exist, grants that were never revoked, letters sealed in wax that no archivist can explain. These aren't the records of pretenders, they're the traces of a second branch of the crown. In 1603, when James VI left Edinburgh for London, something left with him, a chest of private charters labelled Familia Regis Septentrionalis, the royal family of the north. No one saw the contents again. A century later, the line of succession published to Parliament omitted 8 names that had appeared in earlier genealogies. 8. Where did they go? Buried under different surnames, married into minor lairds, sent abroad as merchants, their titles quietly absorbed by England's new nobility. The chroniclers called them cadet lines, but the letters between the courts of France and Scotland suggest something else, a deliberate disappearance. In the archives of Saint-Germain-en-Laye lies a fragment of correspondence from 1702. The northern flame still burns. Keep their names within the convent walls until the island is ready. It's unsigned, written in a cipher used by the exiled Stuarts, and next to it, in a different hand, a single word, Continuare. If this document is genuine, the Stuarts didn't vanish, they scattered. Their bloodlines filtered into Europe's hidden families, their archives sealed under ecclesiastical protection. The question isn't if they survived, it's where their descendants live in plain sight. When James VI crossed the border to become James I of England, his official records went south with him, but a second set of papers stayed in Scotland. These were not laws or proclamations, they were land grants and alliances, private compacts written in his own hand. Archivists refer to them as the North Charters. A handful survive in Edinburgh and Stirling, their seals broken, their margins filled with cipher. One recurring mark stands out, 3 interlocked circles with a crown drawn above. Not the royal seal of Scotland, but a personal device used in the king's French correspondence. The charters link James to minor houses in Fife, Moray, and the Isles, families that quietly received royal protection and funding after the Union. In the letters of the French ambassador Antoine de la Bauderie, these families are described as les cousins du Nord, cousins of the North. Through these families, the Stuart blood moves sideways into Europe. In Brittany, descendants appear under new spellings: Stuart, Stour. In France, one branch merged with the old Guise line, cementing the Franco-Scottish alliance even after it was officially dissolved. By the 1700s, their descendants were marrying into both Jacobite exiles and English merchants, camouflaged in plain sight. These connections explain why later uprisings seemed to find funding from nowhere and why France sheltered so many Scottish nobles who claimed no titles. They were protecting the unbroken thread of the House of Stuart just as the charters instructed. When the Crown left Edinburgh for London, dozens of minor Scottish houses were quietly granted new charters. Most of those families, Innes, Ogilvy, Sinclair, Gordon, Leslie, Drummond, had long blood ties to the Stuarts. After 1603, their fortunes changed overnight. Obscure branches gained royal leases, clerical posts, or small pensions with no explanation. The surviving registers in the Register of the Privy Seal of Scotland show clusters of these grants in Fife, Moray and Argyll between 1603 and 1610. Each grant carries a cipher mark, a small trinity of circles impressed beside the seal. The same symbol appears in James VI's private correspondence, held in the British Library's Cotton manuscripts. To later archivists, the mark meant nothing, but to those families it was recognition of blood. By the later 1600s, these cousins of the North appear under softened spellings. Stuart becomes Stuart, Guise becomes Wise, Leslie becomes Leslie. Their titles fade, but the marriages don't stop. Gordon's linked to French Le Gourdon, the Ogilvys to Breton olives, the Drummonds to Navarrese nobles. Each connection reinforces the Franco-Scottish thread that the union had officially broken. Parish records from Moray even record a series of baptisms where the godparents include Madame de Guise of Rouen, a Guise woman still using her title decades after the family's exile, acting as sponsor for Scottish children, evidence perhaps of the shadow network that kept the Stuart line breathing in France. By 1714, when the official Stuart line was declared extinct, these cousins were already living as merchants, lawyers, physicians. Their heraldic marks disappeared from shields and re-emerged as architectural motifs, 3 rings carved above doorways, or painted on ceilings of Highland houses that were never technically royal. The records don't say royal blood, they say continuity. And continuity is how dynasties survive loss, through the ordinary. They said her words ended with the axe, but words like hers don't end, they change uniform. After Fotheringay, a second court forms in silence. Abbey kitchens, laundry rooms, sick wards. Women who were never painted, never titled, become the conduits. They fold instruction into prayer, inventory into prophecy, compassion into logistics. The church calls them sisters, we call them signal. Paper is chosen for its watermark, a quincunx inside 3 tiny birds. Hold it to dawn, and the mark lines up with 5 verbs hidden across the page. The square laid flat. The ink seems ordinary. Under breath warmth, a second layer blooms, vinegar gall revealing a lane, a barge, a name spoken only once. They stitch needles along the margin, pricks that count out a psalm. Read the numbered verses and you don't find comfort, you find coordinates. A chapel that never locks, a ledger that hides another ledger, a rider who answers only to the dove. Couriers aren't knights, they're widows with baskets, midwives with permission to pass at midnight. Girls who sing psalms off-key, so guards wave them through. Every hymn a distraction, every loaf a container, every mercy a message. This is how a queen speaks when the stage is stolen, not from a throne, but through 1,000 ordinary mouths. Not in proclamations, but in objects that pass inspection. The letters don't survive because they were sacred, they survive because they were useful. And usefulness is the one thing history never learns to kill. When the prisons filled with men, the message moved to women. Abbeys, almshouses and hospitals turned into quiet post offices. The same walls that heard confession now stored parchment. The hubs, Rouen and Dieppe, harbour towns where the Guise family still held property. Nuns of the Annonciade Celeste copied shipping manifests that hid cipher text between cargo tallies. Saint-Germain-en-Laye, former royal palace turned Jesuit college. Its kitchen accounts show ink, wax and salt, ordered by the crate, more than any kitchen would need. Bruges and Antwerp, the English colleges there trained missionary priests. Their laundresses and apothecaries handled medicine parcels that always weighed the same, even when the herbs changed. Each house was a relay, a nun who wrote, a porter who travelled, a merchant's wife who received, a midwife who spoke the words aloud to the next link. No one saw the whole message, everyone carried a piece. The couriers, they didn't wear habits, they wore the day. A widow with a rosary, a nurse with a linen roll, a fishmonger's daughter with ribbons dyed the wrong shade of red. Each had license to move after curfew, mercy work, they said, and that was enough. Their baskets held bread, oil and folded prayers. Folded again, those prayers became royal correspondence. Each convent used its own variant of Mary's cipher. Dovemark means message received, mirror means reply expected. Needle line means urgency, and broken stem means stop transmission. When storms shut the channel, they used psalms sung through the night. Each verse's number corresponded to a word, music as courier. From Dieppe, the letters crossed to Fife or Leith by coastal traders listed simply as for the widow's account. From there, priests disguised as book dealers walked them north. By the time royal officers traced one packet, the information had already leapt 3 borders and 6 languages. The network ran for nearly 30 years long after Mary's death, sustained by women who officially had no power at all. History calls them caretakers. They were the infrastructure of survival. When a kingdom loses its core, it invents language. The women of Mary's circle turned daily life into encryption. Every stitch, every psalm, every line of ink had a second purpose. Most surviving fragments look harmless, devotional poems, recipes or alms lists. But line them side by side and the rhythm breaks. Identical phrases appear at fixed intervals, a spacing pattern called a Cardan grid. Place a cutout sheet over the page and the empty spaces form new sentences. Example, one Antwerp fragment reads as household inventory. Through the lattice it becomes a list of rendezvous ports along the North Sea. A handful of letters in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France show the same watermark, 5 dots in quincunx inside a circle of birds. Archivists date the paper to Rouen between 1580 and 1589. The placement of the mark, always under the word grace, isn't random. Folded correctly, the dots align with 5 words in the text forming the palindrome Sator arepo tenet opera rotas, a visual seal saying authentic within the circle. Textiles became telegrams. A row of decorative needle holes at the edge of parchment or hem corresponds to psalm numbers. Count the punctures, open a psalter to those verses, read the first word of each. The meaning changes with every copy, but the pattern endures. Always a prayer that doubles as a set of coordinates. Under candlelight, the writing looks uniform. Under heat, faint letters bloom in gall ink names, weights, times. Invisible ink wasn't rare, but the consistency of formulas across convents suggests a shared manual. Lost, though chemists have reconstructed the mixture from traces on surviving pages, one Rouen manuscript ends with a short line of reverse Latin, readable only against polished metal. It's the only known instance of what later cryptographers called a specular cipher. When reflected, the text reveals a signature, MR, the cipher Mary used before captivity. Together, these layers form a code that is less about secrecy than resilience. If one form failed, paper burned, song forgotten, the next could still carry the signal. The fragments survive in museums, not because they were decoded, but because archivists thought they were beautiful. They are, but beauty was the disguise. They thought the letters stopped at Fotheringhay. They didn't. They changed skin. When the prisons filled with men, the message moved to women. Abbeys turned to post offices, hospitals became relay stations, and mercy became a mask for movement. Rouen, Dieppe, Bruges, Antwerp, on paper, charity in practice, communication. Wax, ink and salt by the crate, more than any kitchen could justify. They hid intelligence in kindness, linen deliveries, bread baskets, healing herbs. Every act of mercy carried a secret weight, each widow, each nurse, each fishmonger's daughter, a courier with the license to cross at night. They didn't wear habits, they wore the day the world looked away, and that's why it worked. Every convent had its own cipher. A dove mark meant message received, a mirror meant reply expected. A single stitch line, urgent, a broken stem, stop transmission. And when storms closed the channel, they sang psalms through the night. Each verse a word, each hymn a map. The men kept records, the women kept results. No courier list survives, but the Privy Council minutes tell you everything. Men arrested for seditious papers while women with baskets passed unsearched. That was the point. Mercy isn't questioned. Mercy moves freely. When the king left for London, the letters multiplied. Paper traffic exploded across the English colleges Douai, Bruges, Saint-Omer. Every laundry list a coded manifesto, every shipment of wax for votives, another batch of seals for the network. They burned the books so the women rewrote the words in thread. Needlework became encryption, embroidery replaced ink. The same patterns repeat 3 rings above a mirror, pressed into door lintels and stitched into altar cloths. They call them decorations, we call them receipts. The Jacobite years didn't begin the movement, they finished it. A century later, letters from Paris still bloom under heat, with the same mirrored lines of Latin Rouen cipher reborn in exile. By then the couriers weren't queens, they were midwives, travelling after curfew, licensed to enter any house, trusted by everyone, watched by no one. That's how the message survived, through hands that healed, mouths that prayed, and eyes that never met the gaze of power. History calls them caretakers. They were the infrastructure. The signal didn't die with Mary, it adapted. It wove itself into ordinary life, so ordinary that no one noticed. They were living inside the code. Paper glows at dawn, needles count prayers into roots. Wax breathes when warmed by a kitchen lamp. And every forgotten act of mercy was really an act of communication. That's how the voice of a condemned queen walked straight out of the 16th century and kept walking. They called it diplomacy. It was marriage's encryption. Long before crowns were carved in gold, Scotland and France sealed their union in ink and blood. The Old Alliance of 1295, a promise that if one fell, the other would rise. By the 15th century, that pact had turned personal. Stuarts and Guises, Douglas and Bourbon, Lennox and Navarre, each wedding a bridge, each child a treaty that couldn't be signed on paper. The Stuarts didn't just send envoys south, they sent daughters. Mary of Guelders, Anne of Brittany, Mary of Guy's women who carried Scotland's flame into continental courts. They learned French diplomacy and taught French courtiers how to survive Scottish weather, political and literal. When Mary Stuart was born, her cradle already carried 2 coats of arms, the lion rampant and the fleur-de-lis. She wasn't a symbol, she was the contract. But contracts can be rewritten. After the Union of the Crowns in 1603, the New England wanted one throne, one story. To make that work, entire branches of royal cousins were reclassified, no longer princes du sang, just northern merchants or minor gentry. The charters remained in family chests, the bloodlines quietly relabelled. You can still trace them in the paperwork that forgot to lie. Edinburgh Privy Seal registers granting pensions to kinsmen of France. Rouen parish baptisms where Scottish surnames appear in French spellings. Stuart becomes Stour, Lennox becomes Lenoir. Navarre correspondence noting our northern cousins who brought the mist with them. The same pattern repeats after every crisis, a coup, a marriage, a war. One record erased, another begins under a softened name. Lineage becomes logistics. By 1715, when the Jacobite cause ignites, letters between Paris and Edinburgh still open, with the phrase « à ceux du pacte ancien » to those of the Old Covenant. A centuries-old alliance still alive in code. That's what the Covenant bloodlines were, not a secret society, a survival system. Each union a memory device, each erased name a form of protection. History tells you the alliance ended with a treaty, but every map, every name, every coat of arms that blends a lion and a lily whispers that it never really did. The old alliance became the Covenant bloodlines, a living archive written in marriages, still visible in the paperwork that survived the fire, still pulsing in the surnames that cross both languages. They called it diplomacy, it was continuity, and continuity is how the flame survives. They tell you the Union made one kingdom, it didn't. It made two sets of records. When James VI crossed the border to become James I of England, he left a trail of paper behind him. Charters, seals, signatures that never made the trip. They called them duplicates. They weren't duplicates, they were instructions. In Edinburgh and Stirling, archivists still whisper about the North Charters, private grants written in the king's own hand. Bearing a seal, no clerk can identify 3 interlocked rings with a crown above. Not the Royal Seal of Scotland, something older, personal. These charters speak of lands to be held in trust for the king's kin of the north. But look closer at the handwriting. The Latin word used for kin isn't consanguineus, it's foederatus. Not of the blood, of the pact. Same word used in Roman treaties for allied tribes. In other words, the covenant continues. After the union, those charters vanish from the official record. But the names inside them don't. They start appearing on deeds in Fife, Moray and Argyll, tiny parcels of land gifted to merchants, doctors, widows. All signed in the same month, the king's own seal fell silent. Coincidence maybe, but money leaves footprints where history won't. Follow the ledgers and you find a pattern. Rents paid in pounds sterling from London, but collected in French coin along the coast. Cross-currency as cover, a secret economy funding the northern cousins who stayed behind. Even the ink tells a story. The iron gall used in those charters is French-made, but the parchment is Scottish calfskin. Documents born of two worlds, a treaty written into texture. One charter, dated 1605, mentions a place that no longer exists. To our faithful of Balcarrick, keepers of the mirror and the dove. The site was wiped from maps in the 1700s. Its stones repurposed for a manor built by an English earl. Only the lintel survived, carved with 3 rings entwined, the same mark as the king's hidden seal. That's how you know the network wasn't folklore, it was infrastructure. Land disguised as loyalty, faith disguised as finance. Every gift a node in the same invisible circuit. By the time the king died in 1625, his English treasury was in chaos, but his private northern trust was balanced to the coin. Someone was still counting, someone was still guarding. The sealed charters were never about property, they were about preservation. A way to keep the old line funded long after the crown was absorbed into a foreign throne. And if you trace those estates today, the tiny ones, forgotten, misfiled, the farms that still fly, both the thistle and the lily, you'll see the pattern is still alive. Because paper burns, stone crumbles, but chartered land, that endures. The king left more than laws behind, he left a map. They teach you the crown began with the Stuarts. But the Stuarts were just the latest chapter in a book that had already been edited. Before castles and Latin seals, Scotland was a braid of small kingdoms. Dalriata in the west, Pickland in the north, Strathclyde in the south. Each ruled by king groups that shared blood, land and language. Kingship wasn't inheritance, it was selection. A council choosing the one whose ancestry held the right song, the right omen, the right memory of fire. When the Christian scribes arrived, they translated memory into manuscript. And translation is a kind of weapon. Old Gaelic names, Aed, Sinard, Domhnall became Kenneth, Donald, Duncan. Tribal mothers who once named the kings vanished from the story. The matrilineal thread cut, tidied, forgotten. The early chronicles still show the seams. Lines that jump centuries, rulers who share no blood but share the same epithet. MacAlpin, MacAilcade, MacDomnell. Not family names, titles meaning son of the flame, son of the horse, son of the world. They were descriptions of lineage function, not surname. But later chroniclers, writing for courts that demanded ownership, turned symbols into bloodlines, turned memory into monarchy. The Dalriatan kings carried Irish ancestry across the sea. The Pictish houses brought the northern mystery stone circles aligned to solstice, carved beasts facing stars. When they merged under Synaid MacAlpin in the 9th century, two worlds collided, matriarchal memory and patriarchal record. One survived in ink, the other in stone. The stone keeps its truth. Spiral carvings on the Dunnard rock still show the footprint used for coronation. A ritual older than any crown, the king places his bare foot in the mark of his ancestor, binding flesh to land. Later, when iron replaced ritual, that mark was chiselled off. The English chroniclers called it superstition. It was sovereignty. The Gaelic kings didn't vanish. Their names were absorbed into clans. Their lands parcelled out as estates, but the symbols stayed. The boar of the Picts, the red hand of Ulster, the knot of Dalriata. Every tartan pattern, every crest, a fossil of a much older system of sacred geography. So when you read the list of kings that start with the Stuarts, remember, that's not the beginning. That's the point where the flame was written down and therefore controlled. The real origin is older, spoken cyclic Gaelic. Before the crown, there was the covenant of the land itself, and every monarch since has borrowed its authority without realising they're standing on borrowed footprints. They say the bloodline died in Britain. It didn't. It boarded ships. After every failed rising, 1568, 1715, 1745, records show the same pattern. Families removed for safety, estates sold to foreign investors, a trickle of names appearing months later in the ports of France, Spain, the Low Countries. Exile was never disappearance, it was migration under another flag. France, the second court, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Paris, Rouen, houses rented by Scottish merchants who import nothing and export nothing. Their ledgers balance because their business isn't trade, it's transfer. They pass stipends from French patrons to the families still in the Highlands, money disguised as payment for wine, wool or wax. In Bordeaux, the Vieux-Port manifest lists cargo consigned to names that mirror lost Jacobite officers, same initials, French endings. The harbour masters never ask, gold moves quieter than loyalty. After the 1745 defeat, hundreds of Highland soldiers joined Spanish regiments, Los Escoceses. The Bourbon crown gives them land grants near Cadiz and Seville. Parish books there still hold Scottish surnames warped by Castilian tongues. Maclean becomes Maglin, Campbell becomes Campbell, Stuart becomes Estuardo. Some of those families still keep thistles carved into door lintels, no tourist ever notices. Antwerp and Bruges, already thick with Mary's old correspondence, become the printing presses of the exiles. Small devotional books, manuals for prayer, printed with the same 5-dot watermark as the Rouen ciphers. Inside them, handwritten marginalia, lists of ports, coded initials, psalm numbers. Half faith, half logistics. By the late 1600s, Scottish and French settlers in Nova Scotia and the Caribbean appear under Spanish and French charters. Many register as Catholic converts, a perfect disguise for Jacobite loyalists. In a 1703 census of Martinique, the notary records a planter named Jean Estuard, who signs with 3 rings intertwined. No explanation, just the same seal that trails back to the North Charters of James VI. Exile didn't scatter the flame, it networked it. Each migration, another circuit. Each lost name, another alias keeping the signal alive. Letters in France, pensions in Spain, books in Belgium, footprints in the colonies, all humming with the same geometry. Official history calls it diaspora, the archives call it coincidence. But coincidences don't leave matching seals in 3 countries. The exile families didn't fade, they learned to translate. Blood into commerce, faith into paperwork, memory into accent. The crown fell, the language adapted. And wherever that tri-ring mark appears in stone, in paper, in trade, you're seeing more than heritage. You're seeing continuity under a different passport. Every exile dreams of return. But return doesn't always mean a ship coming home. Sometimes it means a signal coming back. By the 19th century, the official records forget them, but trade ledgers remember. Names with foreign endings appear beside Highland goods timber, saltfish, wool. Merchants in Bordeaux sign contracts in a hand too old for the century, looped like 17th century script. Old habits in new ink. Missionary societies reopen routes the Jacobites once used. Education for the poor becomes the new cover. Books, arms and letters move again. and with them the same watermark, 3 rings and a crown, faint as breath. Across the Atlantic, in Nova Scotia, a stone in a churchyard carries the inscription Foederatus Dei. Allied of God, the pact's still spoken, even if no one knows they're speaking it. By the 1900s, the line doesn't wear robes or tartan. It works in archives, museums, libraries. Curators with no idea why they're drawn to certain manuscripts, historians obsessed with the years nobody studies, the descendants of exile guarding their own evidence, filing the puzzle back into public record, one fragment at a time. That's the long return, not a homecoming, an integration. The flame dissolving into the world so completely that the world itself becomes the archive. Because exile was never exile, it was preservation in transit. And every generation that asks what was erased is proof that the signal still moves. 6 stories, 6 strands of the same thread. From the vanished lines of the Stuarts to the couriers who carried Mary's words in bread and linen. From the covenant bloodlines that married nations together to the charters James VI sealed against forgetting. From the Gaelic kings who ruled by song and footprint to the exiles who crossed oceans with the same flame hidden under new names. You've seen how every generation rewrote the script, how every erasure left an outline, and how every outline became the next map. History calls this fragmentation. I call it continuity disguised as loss. Because the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that Scotland's crown was never a single object. It was a network, a living system of families, faiths and covenants designed to survive resets, unions and purges. The Crown Veiled wasn't just a series about kings and queens, it's about why their memory still walks. Why the same marks appear on coins, charters and graves centuries apart. Why every time a dynasty ends, a new surname quietly begins. The line didn't die, it translated. Language to stone, stone to blood, blood to signal. And now, centuries later, the signal speaks again, not through coronations, but through questions. Through those who notice the patterns. Through you. This is the continuation. The next covenant isn't about heritage, it's about awareness. What happens when we finally remember that history was never linear? It was circular, coded, alive. The veil lifts one name at a time, and the flame keeps walking. Continuare.